Hello and welcome to another of our NWBA online reflections. Every culture and community has its catchphrases and its rallying cries, those statements and sentences that somehow define who people are and what they're about if they're part of that community. So, for example, if like me, you are a supporter of Liverpool Football Club, it won't be long before someone says to you, "You'll never walk alone." Or if you come from the USA, perhaps you might talk about the Declaration of Independence or the First Amendment. Though I must confess, until I prepared this, I wasn't even sure what the First Amendment is. But I know it's there and I know it's important to people. But then when I did look it up, it reminded me that words and phrases don't remain contained within those great statements and declarations from which they come. So the First Amendment speaks of the basic freedoms of religion and speech and assembly. And then you recognise how words like liberty and liberation and even phrases like human rights have come out of that and actually have defined society as a whole. So the language that people speak and the words that they frequently use tell us something about their society and their culture. And for me, as an English-speaking citizen of the United Kingdom, I can't help but notice how many words and phrases that we use in everyday speech have their roots in the narratives of the Christian faith. So people who aren't particularly religious might still speak of something being set or not being set in tablets of stone. And of course, they're referring back to the Old Testament event in Exodus when the Ten Commandments were said to be given to Moses on tablets of stone. Even the phrase, "the skin of your teeth," actually comes from the Old Testament book of Job. And when we speak of someone doing something with all their heart and soul, which again is a phrase we use very frequently, I suspect too that this phrase originates in one of the other great statements of the Bible, one that calls the people of God to love God with all their heart and soul and strength. We find it in chapter 6 of the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. And it's also quoted in the New Testament Gospel of Luke. And this too is one of those nation-defining statements that people of the Jewish faith and culture to this day see as central to their identity. And when a contemporary of Jesus repeated this declaration, often called the Shema, he added a further element to love God with all our mind and to love our neighbour as ourselves. And Jesus affirmed this as a vital expression of identity. But don't take my word for it. Let's read this from Luke chapter 10. And I'm going to start reading at verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What's written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" And he answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself." "You've answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself. And so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbour?" Who is my neighbour? Well, it's in response to that question that Jesus told the story that's come to be known as the Good Samaritan. The story of someone travelling from Jerusalem to Jericho, very much in the heartland of Jesus' own religious identity. And the man is mugged and robbed and beaten and left for dead. And then a priest and a Levite, a temple officer, pass that way, but both cross the road to avoid him. And it's a Samaritan who stops and binds up his wounds and takes care of him. And there again, we find one of those phrases that people with very little religious intent will still use to this day. How often have you heard someone described as a good Samaritan? But here's the thing. To the people who first listened to Jesus tell that story, describing someone as a Samaritan would have actually been something of an insult. To Jesus' contemporaries, despising Samaritans was as identity defining as repeating the Shema and wearing it and its text as you walked around. So there's a massive irony here. to the point that many might well have actually found this story offensive when they first heard Jesus tell it. Jesus takes a defining statement of faith, but when someone asks for an example of that faith in practice, Jesus points to someone who would have been a total outsider. This is how you see it in action, says Jesus. Now go and do the same. And it's interesting that while these words, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, are very high and grand sentiments, they are presented to us as an utterly grounded phrase. In the case of the book of Deuteronomy, where it first appears, it's the introduction to a law code. And many of the laws that follow have a fair bit to do with what we might call religious regulations, but a lot of them don't. The law codes of Deuteronomy include such issues as food hygiene, financial regulation to avoid undue inequality, even such matters as making sure you put safety rails around your parapets and ensuring that there is decent sanitation. Yes, public loos have their origin in Deuteronomy chapter 23. And I think there's something significant to notice in that. Loving the Lord your God with every ounce of your being is not a matter of being obsessively religious or relentlessly devout. It's equally expressed by making sure there are decent loos for people to use and that any buildings that people go into are safe. And we see something of that real life application in Jesus too, when Jesus makes the point that you show your love for God by loving your neighbour, and the teacher of the law asks for an example. It isn't to the great religious temple in Jerusalem that Jesus points, but the road outside it that leads to Jericho, and a half-dead figure slumped in the gutter, and a complete stranger that was the least religiously acceptable person on the planet as far as his listeners were concerned. If you want to see what loving the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength is all about, says Jesus, take your example from that lone traveller, who would certainly not have been travelling to or from Jerusalem for any religious purpose. And I sense that there's something quite important in that for us to grasp as we reflect on this story and these realities for a few minutes. If we are to accept all those descriptions in the New Testament that speak of us as being a royal priesthood and a holy nation and a people belonging to God, then we are called to love the Lord our God, just like those early Israelites who were addressed in the book of Deuteronomy, just like that teacher of the law who came to Jesus with his question. And as we look at the way these words are presented to us, we can't escape the fact that this is more than mere sentiment for us to sign up to, or a nice sounding phrase for us to learn off by heart and then recite. It has to be lived, just like it was lived by the house builders and the financial regulators of the Old Testament, just like it was lived through the compassion of a Samaritan in the New. Now, to be fair, the book of Deuteronomy does contain a fair amount of prescribed religious rituals too. So yes, loving the Lord your God could be expressed by gathering in the temple and observing the festivals and participating in the prescribed worship rites. But there were other ways for people to show their devotion to God too. And if we fast forward to the writings of the Old Testament prophets, they could be pretty scathing when the worship rituals were being followed to the letter, but without the accompaniment of the justice and fairness in wider society that Deuteronomy prescribes. And why I feel that's important for us right now is because recent events have caused some pretty major disruptions to our religious activities. And sure, we miss them. And perhaps we've come to realise how much we valued them since they've had to stop. And yes, I guess that through them, we have often been reminded of the call to love the Lord our God with our heart and our soul and our strength and our mind. And they will often be the key vehicle through which we express that commitment. But they don't need to be the only vehicle. And it seems to me that if they have been the main way that we've expressed our love for God, then the story of the Good Samaritan and the broader narratives of Deuteronomy offer us something of a challenge, but also an opportunity. We can either put our relationship with God on hold and wait for the religious stuff to start again, or we can invest more of our energy into expressing our love for God in ways that can continue during lockdown and social distancing. And that's what I want to invite you to reflect on for a few minutes. And it does strike me that the four elements in this statement offer quite a useful framework for us to work with. So if you're a regular to these short videos, you'll know what I'm going to say. Find some space and some time when you know you've got the capacity to center yourself on God and not be distracted by other stuff. Or if it helps, get in touch with someone you know and do this as a conversation together. Find these words in the Bible, either from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5, or possibly easier from Luke chapter 10 and verse 27, and just think about each of these elements in turn. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Our faith is founded on a relationship. And all of those practical regulations in the book of Deuteronomy are founded on a relationship with God. And for that Samaritan to do what he did for a fellow human being was not a matter of religious duty. In fact, many people who look at this story suggest that it was religious duty that prevented the priest and the Levite from getting involved and helping the poor man. So let yourself remember, first of all, that God loves you. And maybe spend some time reflecting on how you have experienced God's love in your own life journey. What is it about God's nature and God's goodness that gives you cause to love God? And maybe just recognize that your emotions are there as part of your worship, as part of your expression of response to this God who loves you. It's okay to have a faith that includes our emotions and to love God with all of our heart. And then we're invited to love the Lord our God with all our soul. Now, I'm not sure any of us can claim to forensically define the difference between heart and soul in this context. But for me, if heart reflects the breadth of our emotions, then perhaps soul reflects something of the depth of our being. Our emotions are perhaps more of a reaction to immediate circumstances and experiences, whereas what we describe as soul is perhaps more an expression of who we are irrespective of our circumstances. So perhaps within this there is an invitation to search ourselves a little bit, to perhaps ask if there are bits of us that we try to hide away from God, or maybe deep-seated hurts and disappointments, or for that matter hopes and ambitions that we don't always allow God to connect with. So let's take that opportunity and to let these things become part and parcel of how and why we love God, not things that get in the way of loving God. And yes, love requires effort, and effort requires strength, and we're called to love God with all our strength. For that Samaritan, who I know was fictitious, but he represented a willingness to overcome deep-seated prejudices and divisions in order to express love for God. So where do we need God's strength? Where do we need to invest our own strength and effort in order to show our love for God in our present circumstances? What are the equivalents of the man lying in the road right now, who might not be the most obvious or immediate people around us? Or maybe those that experience may have conditioned us to not notice or to recognize. Where do we need to put the effort in order to love God with all of our being? And we can also love God with all of our mind. So maybe if you can't get along to your usual raft of activities and responsibilities, is that a chance to use some of that time to learn something more of God? This might be something as simple as deciding to read a book, or maybe dig into a particular part of the Bible for a while, or perhaps it's just a matter of applying your mind to present circumstances. It may not be obvious at first, but maybe if you stop and do some deliberate thinking, are there ways that you can live out your love for God in the here and now, in the present realities? So yes, we can love the Lord our God with every ounce of our being by singing our great hymns of praise and worship, by busying ourselves in doing good, by gathering together and sharing our common life of discipleship. But we can also love God by picking up wounded strangers at the roadside, by addressing the inequalities in our communities, by making sure people are safe and cared for. And when Jesus told the story of the most unexpected of people doing just that, he followed it with a very simple instruction: go and do likewise. Thanks for listening.